Good turnout for our neighbor and friend, Sam Lemon. It's a pleasure to welcome you this evening. And you might know that there are probably 40 or 50 people watching us live streaming from various parts of the country. I know there are people in Denver and Maine and California and Florida and New York, and probably some within the immediate area that are watching us. Thomas Swain, I think, is showing it live streaming at Crosslands. And so we're know that this audience is swelled by numbers beyond our vision. For those of you who are live streaming, I'd like to welcome you to this space as well. And in order for us to keep kind of a track of all those people who've registered and then actually are seeing us tonight, I would ask you to just hit the chat button and put your name in so we know who has both registered and is seeing us live. That would be wonderful. Thank you. As many of you know who are part of our first Monday lectures, we do not interrupt this with commercial announcements. We put them right at the front. So coming up in 2 weeks from tonight is the first of 3 lectures called Three Great Themes of the Bible. Sarah Rudin, who many of you know, is a much acclaimed classics scholar. She's also a Quaker, and having turned from Petronius and Aristophanes and the real classics to Biblical Greek and studying Hebrew, she is now working on a translation of the Gospels for the Modern Library. She's spoken here before, and one of the extreme advantages of her approach is that she is a Quaker and reads the Bible in the way many Quakers have believed it should be read, which is it is divinely inspired, speaks to us today, and it's helpful to read it knowing the context and the audience to which it was originally addressed by the various authors who composed it. And she brings that, as well as an appreciation for the rhetoric and the style of the original literature, brings that to us so that we can be inspired in our reading as well. Her first of the 3 lectures that are going to be over the next several months is on compassion, which has really rich and vibrant metaphors throughout both the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures. So I invite you to come on February 14th, same time as our normal, 7:30 to 9, to hear Sarah Rudin. Our next Monday lecture will be by Rabbi Mordecai Liebling, who is an extraordinarily good lecturer and teacher. He really is a Rebbe. So I hope you'll come for his talk about how anti-Semitism has supported power structures and is used to divide progressives. A timely topic, particularly those who've been following the Women's Marches know, and examining this both as a historical phenomenon and how it is changed with social media and so forth. So I recommend that on the first Monday in March. And Sam tonight will speak to us out of the silence, but I want to introduce him. He is speaking tonight on a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. It has been threaded and woven throughout our various conferences as we address ending mass incarceration, looking beyond crime and punishment, truth and healing, all of which have involved our making peace with a history that very few of us know deeply. And when history eludes us and we live by a mythology, we are not starting from the ground of truth, from which Quakers believe you must, and many others believe you must start with the truth. The example that Sam is involved with his own family, I think is instructive for all of us to see how myths live on and affect outcomes. So tonight we'll have both an overview of the process of telling truth about history and how to write, I call it writing history, that I think Sam has been engaged in for the last 30 years. You may know that he is an educator at Newman University and a friend at Providence Friends Meeting, as well as an author. You'll have an opportunity to look at his book this evening. He has just a few copies, so rush in. The last time I was at one of Sam's talk, I missed getting the book, so. Without further delay, I think we could settle into a period of respectful silence and prepare Sam and prepare us to receive his message.
Hello? Okay. And thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. And just before, a few minutes ago, I was checking my Facebook page, and I have friends from around the country who are live streaming in, so that makes me feel like really nervous. So I don't know what John promised everyone. But you should have gotten it beforehand. But again, thank you. This is a real treat and a real honor to be back here at Pendle Hill. There's a great quote. Oftentimes when I'm teaching a class at the university, I start out with cogito ergo sum, and 1666, the great René Descartes, the great French philosopher and mathematician, said, "I think, therefore I am." And I've always liked that, but I think there's a better one. And that is from John Mbiti, who is since passed away, but a famous, a great African scholar and theologian. And he says, "I am because we are. And since we are, therefore I am." And I think that's a better approach because we're all products of our environment and our families and our communities. We don't appear out of nature on our own. So that's a very important kind of underpinning to all this. And so is the issue of spirituality. I don't delve into that too much here, but it's more than an underpinning, in terms of this story. I first heard about this story from my grandmother. I was about 10 years old when I was living with her in this very same house I live in today. And we were kind of an odd couple, and I just loved spending time with her. When my cousins were out, playing in the street and stuff, there I was at the dining room table with my grandmother. memorizing the family history, and she'd bring out all the old photographs, and I had this burning need to know, like, well, what did they say, and what did they do, and how did they think about these things? How did they deal with stuff? At a very young age, I just kind of took this like a sponge and memorized all this. The importance of not only grandmothers in our society, which dates back to primeval times, but also the transmission of oral history. Before there was the printed word, there was the spoken word, and everything my grandmother told me turned out to be true. And I was able to, substantiate that through research as I got older. She didn't know all the details of things. She knew, for example, where her grandparents, who were former runaway slaves from Virginia, who separately made their way to Media and were taken in by Isaac and Elizabeth Smedley Yarnall, who were members of Providence Quaker Meeting. And she could tell me the names of the plantations, but she didn't know where they were because nobody in my family had ever gone back to Virginia to search for those places after they had escaped. So there are a couple of kind of concurrent themes that go along here, in terms of being part of a family, being part of a community, having that oral history passed down, which is just incredibly important because everybody wants to be from somewhere. Everyone wants to be able to point back and say, we came from here. And for people of color, sometimes that's extremely difficult because one of the great purposes of slavery was to divest people of that history, of their language, and to pretend that didn't exist. I'd read somewhere that, like in Rhodesia or South Africa, in the educational systems, they were teaching children there was no one here. We were the first people to arrive here, to discover Africa, and so there's that kind of thinking that goes along, with the history of America. But American history is best understood through the lens of family history. So when things happen today, John alluded to, and others I've been chatting with, it's not ancient history. So when you see a picture of a guy, wearing a Klan suit, that means something to me because the house I live in, the KKK visited a mob of Klansmen in Media on Olive Street carrying torches. And they came to see my great-grandfather. So there's a direct connection. And in terms of other issues of Jim Crow and discrimination, many of us have experienced those things, or at least the generation before us. Sometimes on Facebook, I keep in touch with old classmates and stuff, and there was one discussion in one of the web pages about old Media, and people were saying, "Oh, wasn't that great when we used to, go swimming at Brummels Lake, and that's just really wonderful." And I said, "Well, but people of color like me weren't allowed to swim there." It's like, didn't you notice? And they didn't. A lot of people didn't. And so, it's essential to kind of have a broader worldview, not just in terms of the cultures and the families and the places that we came from. So my grandmother tells me this story, and it made one heck of an impact on me as a 10-year-old, along with many of the other things that she told me, and I couldn't forget it. And as time went on, I grew up, I got into social work, I was making connections, and I started pursuing this. And that was, 30-some years ago. And I've never been able to stop doing it. It's never been a choice for me. This is, as we Quakers say, is a leading. So it's something like, you get this assignment and you can't say no, So, I'm sure there were days when Noah didn't feel like working on that ark. But, sometimes I feel like that because it's my duty, and I'm happy to do it, and I'm supposed to do it. And by doing it, I can honor, hopefully, and by bringing out fresh information and new information, help that process of healing, the intergenerational healing. But it's been a really heavy load to bear. There were some times when it just wore on me really emotionally, and particularly thinking about Alexander McClay Williams, a 60-year-old kid sitting in the electric chair. There were times when that would just bring me to tears. I couldn't bear thinking about that anymore. But from somewhere, something, that thing which is That power which is a part of all people and all things kind of gave me the energy to continue on. I'm not really sure how, but I feel like it's a leading from the Spirit. So I'm honored to do that. I think if I can complete my task in this, which is to get this wrongful conviction overturned, then I really will feel like I've truly accomplished something in my life. So this is the book. And how many have not heard this story or read any articles about it? Anybody? Okay, so a good number. Okay, so I'm going to give you some back history. I'm going to probably, there are parts that I'm sort of going to whip through a little bit because I want to get more to the intergenerational stuff. But I do want to give you a firm foundation. So who should I point this at? Up here?
No.
Back there.
Oh, it's gone to the pointer again, or has it?
Or is it going through you?
Am I stopped?
If you could just hit the space bar, that will, yep, okay, there you go. Okay, so this is Vida Ribera. And as you can see, do you need this, John?
Yeah, let
Okay.
me see if I can get it back to
All right.
the place.
So as you can see, Friday night, October 3rd, 1930, at 5 p.m., she was found murdered in her bedroom at Glen Mills School. And her husband, who was the last person to see her alive and the first person to found her murdered, reported this to school authorities. They quickly contacted the Delaware County District Attorney's Office and the county detectives. It was a case that got picked up by the AP, Associated Press, and was carried in newspapers all across the country, as far as Texas and Mississippi and California, even British Columbia on the Pacific coast. So it was quite a story. She was very popular, and as you can see, she was 34 years old. Just by all accounts, just a wonderful woman, sterling work record, and it was quite a blow to see someone murdered like this. Okay, next. Okay, this is the cottage, the left-hand side. These are cottages, believe it or not. On the right-hand side is another cottage, it's cottage number 3. On the left is cottage number 5, and that's where Vida and her husband and her 10-year-old son lived. I just had a remarkable, wonderful support from the administration at Glen Mills School when I first started on this some 30 years ago. I wrote to the head of the school. He gave me complete permission to go to the Pennsylvania Historical Society. That's where their archives are kept, to look at the students' records. They gave me a tour of the school because I wanted to see all of the sites I had read about in the articles and in the trial transcript. So she was found in the second floor left there, bedroom. I visited that room probably about 1999 or so. It's a very small room. So one of the things that the newspapers reported was that her son came home from public school. He was about 10 years old, allegedly very nearsighted. He came into the room and spent time in there. It doesn't say what he was doing, but apparently he didn't see his mother's body wedged between the bed and the wall where the window is. I find that extremely difficult to believe, but that's what the paper said. Next.
Did I do that? Oh, good.
Too many? One back? Okay. So these are material facts of the
I
crime.
think if you go press this going
That one,
forward,
okay, the one on the right.
it would
Okay.
work.
So she was found that afternoon. She was partly dressed, which was not unusual because the matrons were off duty at that time of the day. So the boys and the men were out in the fields or in the factories, and they were doing stuff. So you can imagine how heavy women's clothing in 1930 probably was. So at that time of the day, they were off duty. They were kind of lounging in their apartments. She had been eating a pear, and there was an open magazine on the bed. The coroner found that she had been stabbed at least 38 times, which was later determined to be an ice pick. She had actually been stabbed 47 times altogether after an autopsy. And the 3 stabs that penetrated her heart and lungs were the cause of death. She also had a fracture on the right side of the skull and 2 broken ribs. there was almost no evidence whatsoever. There were no witnesses seen leaving the building. Tunnels connected all of the buildings on campus. The tunnels were used by staff to transport unruly students between buildings. And as you can see, Dr. John M. Hutchings was the coroner. The district attorney took personal charge of this case. One curious thing was that there was a bloody left handprint from a man left on the wall near the bedroom door. And that was photographed by the Pennsylvania State Police. It was examined by two fingerprint experts, one from Philadelphia, one from media. There was much made about this in the paper, and we're going to find out imminently who did this. But curiously, there was a wristwatch and $15 left on the victim's bureau. In 1930, $15 would have been worth about $215. So murder doesn't seem to have been the cause. One thing that was missing were the victim's keys. So that was kind of curious. So she and her husband were in charge of 48 Negro boys, as they were called at that time, ages 11 to 14 years. So so downstairs was pretty much like a normal house, in a kitchen and probably a parlor and dining room. Upstairs was the apartment for the house parents, and then there was also in another part of the building a dormitory in which the boys would sleep. And the houses, the cottages, had doors on spring latches. So if you open the door, it would automatically shut. There was no kind of a door being left open, although that was kind of an argument some people were making at the time. There were 600 inmates at Glen Mills at that time. Glen Mills at that time was essentially a prison for teenagers. It was run like a prison. In my tour of the grounds with the archivist, he told me, much like during plantation days, that the boys are rented out sometimes to farms and factories to do work, and then the school would be paid for their labor. It was a pretty harsh place. They had this kind of system of what they called best boys, sort of like trustees, older boys who would kind of, run the show. There was a lot of abuse, physical and sexual abuse, that type of thing. The couple, Fred and Vida Robert, had been married almost 15 years earlier, 14 years earlier in Michigan. So these are some of the newspapers that carried the story. So you can see it goes far beyond our local Philadelphia and Delaware County papers. It's just really astonishing when you see, and this is not an exhaustive list. There were other newspapers around the country that picked this up. It was a baffling case. It was unprecedented in county history. And you can see these quotes. George T. Butler, he was a member of the board. "I don't see how a boy could have done this deed. A youthful mind would seek to flee the place, yet every one of the 600 boys was accounted for." The chief county detective said, "This crime was committed by a full-grown and strong man. This woman was unmistakably athletic and could have fought off a boy." The district attorney said, "The movements of every boy and man known to be on the grounds yesterday is being checked." And Dr. Hutchings, the coroner, said there was no criminal attack, meaning she was not sexually assaulted. The husband said he didn't know anything that would help investigators. So that happened on October 3rd. A week later, Alexander McClay Williams, a young African-American student, inmate as they called him in those days, he was also learning disabled, was able to read his entire school record down at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. He was interviewed, interrogated about 5 or 6 times, as I could sort of piece everything together. The first 3 times he vehemently denied any involvement in this. But after that third interrogation, and we don't know exactly what went on during these interrogations, then he, quote unquote, confessed. I think certainly he was coerced. It's a matter of also school record that he had been disciplined pretty severely. They used to give students lashes. So he was lashed somewhere between 20 and 40 times for various offenses. Even the U.S. Navy had stopped lashing sailors by 1930. So as you can see, that was a pretty primitive form of punishment. And he was committed to the school by Chief Judge W. Roger Fonfield in 1926 as being incorrigible. So for 30 years, I'm trying to find a picture of this kid. Even his family didn't have any pictures. Their family, you know, sort of photos had been lost or destroyed over the years. But this was sent to me by my colleague, Teresa Smithers of Michigan. And Teresa is tuned in tonight. Hello, Teresa. And it was, Vida Robert was Teresa's niece. So Teresa and I connected over Ancestry.com. It was just, the information that she gave me was just phenomenal. There's no way that I could have gotten some of the information that I obtained without Teresa's help. And that tells me that neither the prosecution nor the defense knew this information either in 1930, because as you know, there was no internet. So I can't really tell, but it looks to me like Alexander's left eye is blackened. You know, it's like partially closed. So I can imagine that was a result of one of his interrogations. This photograph was sent to me by a research librarian of the Charles Blockson collection at Temple University. And I believe this is, it's either from the Philadelphia Inquirer or it might be from the Philadelphia Tribune. I think it's very likely the Tribune. But as you can see, he looks like Daniel in the Lion's Den. You know, I mean, he's paraded around. I had contacted the Delaware County District Attorney's Office multiple times over the year. Over the years, they kept telling me, no, all that information is gone, that was all destroyed. It was so where did, you know, this photograph come from? And the other photograph was from the New York Daily Post. So how is it that we don't have any here in Delaware County? I also checked with the Delaware County Daily Times, who have been just phenomenally generous and providing publicity to Alexander and his case. Their archives are sort of separated in different places. They've been trying to look through their photo files, but as of yet have not been able to find a photo of him. But he grew up, you know, not far from here in Bridgewater, you know, Bridgewater Road, kind of the upland Chester border. At the time, his family was not living there. They were living out near Cheney. So, he signs 3 confessions. And when you read these confessions, I was fortunately able to find, it was through Mary Schaefer of the Philadelphia Inquirer filed a Freedom of Information Act request that the county produced the original trial transcript and accompanying documents. So had it not been for that, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you today, because that trial transcript, which took me about 8 hours to read, told me everything I needed to know about this case. So he claims that in this confession, and each confession, when you read it, gets a little more detailed, a little more sophisticated, a little more lurid than the one before. This was a boy who read very poorly. Had you know, problems in terms of, you know, concentration and comprehension. He did not write these confessions. Someone else wrote these confessions. It's really quite obvious. So he claims that he was out on a work assignment, and he and a group of 10 boys and their supervisor, boys had to be under supervision at all times, were repairing a section of road, a driveway at Glen Mills. So he was sent on an errand. Actually, he was sent on 2 errands. The first errand, he and a white boy were sent to go get 10 shovels from the tool shed. They went, they got the shovels, came back, 20 minutes time. Then his work supervisor, Alexander, said, the tool shed guy wants you to sign this receipt and return this receipt. So the supervisor said, well, you take it back. So Alexander was, you know, going another 20 minutes, just like the first time. But allegedly during this 20 minutes, the prosecution said he committed 15 separate actions. And these are just a few. He broke into a cottage to steal shoe black, shoe blackening, shoe polish. It was a matter of school record that he had stolen 110 cans of shoe polish. There was no explanation as to why he did that. It's not because he had a little cottage industry going on. It's not because he had the shiniest shoes on campus. I think it was probably substance abuse. You know, at that time, probably shoe polish had denatured alcohol or other things. He was probably using that. I came across an article in the Delaware Daily Times about 1915 that said one of the boys there had died from cocaine heart. So he had been playing, apparently he had taken cocaine and died while he was playing. So that tells me substance abuse was an issue here as well. So he wasn't able to open the storage closet. He heard the victim moving about upstairs. So he's in the back of the building on the first floor, and he hears the victim moving around in her bedroom on the second floor at the other end of the building with a bunch of doors between them. So that he decided that he was going to go up and assault her. You know, supposedly there was an argument. He physically assaulted her. She, you know, after stabbing her multiple times, his hat fell in a pool of blood. So he grabbed his hat, he grabbed her keys and the murder weapon and ran away and hid those things. Why he needed her keys is baffling, because he didn't need the keys to get out of the building. He needed the keys to get into the building, which he didn't have. So that's very interesting. About 2 weeks after he made his third confession, he was finally given an attorney. So all of these confessions, these 3 confessions and these 5 or 6 interrogations, there was no parent or attorney in the room. He was there by himself with a group of angry men. So they appointed William H. Ridley. So William H. Ridley is my great-grandfather, and so is my grandmother's father, who told me about, he was my grandmother's father, and she was the one who told me about these cases. You can see what he was paid, and he had $10 for expenses. So for a murder, capital murder case, that was pretty much nothing. He was the first African-American attorney, member of the Delaware County Bar. In 1891, he was a graduate of Media High School. In 1887, there would not be a second member of color in the county bar until the 1940s. And in 1960, the third African-American member joined the bar, and 10 years later, he was appointed our first black judge by Governor Milton Schatt. So 1891 to 1970. This is the prosecutorial team, as you can see. Talking about David and Goliath, okay? So the deck was heavily stacked against him. The fingerprint experts, all these, you know, heavy hitters. Charles Edwin Fox, who was the chairman of the board, was the former DA of Philadelphia. And then you have William H. Ridley on the side of the defense. So there was a really important piece of testimony, and it baffled me as to, I guess they had to leave it in there, but it was so powerful that it should have cast huge doubt on this case. So among the witnesses testifying was August Schneider, who was Alexander's work supervisor, who had sent him on these errands. He was also happened to be in charge of the powerhouse. So the kids kind of ran the buildings and things like that, the laundry, that sort of thing. So it was while he was on this errand that he allegedly murdered the victim. They said he showed us where he washed his hands in the warm water and where he threw her keys. That's an actual picture from campus. I think basically he was told what to do and where to place these things. Did I skip something? Okay. So it was an open and shut case. It was a all-white jury. It was this very same judge who adjudicated him delinquent 4 years earlier, which he should have recused himself from that. That certainly would have been prejudicial. I would imagine that the judge was very angry that Alexander hadn't seen the error of his ways and turned around and did something horrific like this. So there was no sympathy for him whatsoever. It was a 2-day trial. Ridley asked for time to file a motion, which he did, but that was quashed. Alexander was there's a little more drama to this, but it doesn't really impact the outcome. So he was sentenced to die in an electric chair. And this is probably the same electric chair that he died in. This was taken about 4 years after he died. This is about 1934, this photograph of the electric chair. So at Rockview State Prison. A few days before that, the Pennsylvania State Board of Pardons had an alienist, is which they called psychiatrists in those days, examine him, and they said that he was sane. But that was never the question, that he was sane or not. The question was, A, did he do it? Did he have the mental ability to do this kind of detailed, complex planning and that sort of thing and cover up? But that was not an issue. So at 7:03 in the morning, one shock of 2,000 volts was applied to him, and 3 minutes later, the prison physician declared that he was dead. Okay. This is I've always liked this quote. It's basically it's been kind of simplified that, and erroneous in some ways. All things being equal, the most likely explanation is the right one. And generally speaking, that is often true, but it's not often true in science and physics and other things where more complicated explanations could be the root, the theory that solves a case. But so with the plurality should not be posited without necessity, meaning if you don't have facts, if you're not adding facts to an investigation, then don't add other extraneous stuff because it's just going to muddy the water. So, kind of mulling all this over and reading all these documents and probably every newspaper account, the Delaware County Daily Times at least, reading the trial transcript, it was clear to me that he didn't have the means, motive, opportunity, or ability to commit this crime. That they didn't even establish a prima facie case, let alone beyond a reasonable doubt. There was some evidence that was unknown, unexamined, unexplained, and some documents were actually altered. There were no witnesses or fingerprints. Basically, the prosecution rested everything on his 3 confessions. And it was a very interesting piece in terms of the confessions. And so at the trial testimony, defense counsel Ridley was questioning one of the detectives about the circumstances under which he removed Alexander from prison to get these confessions. And Alexander was in Delaware County Prison, not to be removed except to attend another hearing. He was under a writ of habeas corpus by a local magistrate. So Ridley says to the detective, how did you get him out of the prison? And the detective says, well, I brought him out by automobile. He said, no, that's not what I mean. How did you get him out of the prison? He said, well, I just went to the magistrate and I got a release form and took it to the prison. I got him, I took him to the district attorney's office. And Ridley said, did you tell the magistrate why you were removing him? And he said, no. So this is a lie by omission. Okay. So here's January 6th. And so when Ridley said, did you tell the magistrate what purpose he wanted, and the detective said, I did not, the DA interjects. And he says, I object to that, of course, court please. And Ridley says, it's very important that I should know, and before he could finish his sentence, the judge cut him off. What materiality has it? Ridley says, I don't think the district attorney has any right or authority, may it please the court, and the judge cuts him off again. Suppose that be true. What does that got to do with it? Suppose that be true. So Ridley says, well, just to show the methods that they used in order to get a confession from the defendant. That is the only question that arises in my mind. The judge says, I sustain the objection. Now, what Ridley's saying is, this is an illegal confession. This should have been thrown out. There should be no confession. And since each confession was built on the one before that, getting more detailed and more, written like an adult and more lurid, this confession should have been tossed. And the judge is admitting the conditions under which they obtained this illegal confession. He says, so what does it matter? So the judge oversteps bounds of jurisprudence. And I think, certainly if he's not committing a crime, he's certainly, violating the standards of judicial behavior and ethics. So Alexander didn't get the chance to testify at trial. And at first I thought this was puzzling. But after I read the entire trial transcript and I got a better sense of his state of mind and his abilities, he would have made a lousy witness. He was very confused. He was very under a great deal of pressure. He had probably been beaten or threatened at the very least. You saw his eye. So they interviewed him off-site, and then they read his testimony at court as if he was testifying. And so the DA says to Alexander, did you have any trouble with Mr. Robert? Alexander says, yes, sir. McCarter, and did you make a request that you be removed from cottage number 5? That's where the murder occurred. Alexander, yes, sir. McCarter, well, why did you kill Mrs. Robert? Alexander said, well, one reason was I was after the keys, and another reason why I just wanted to get even with him. McCarter says, get even with who? Alexander, Mr. Robert. McCarter, why did you want to get even with Mr. Robert? Alexander, for the things he'd done to me. McCarter, what had he done to you? Alexander, when I was over in their cottage, he used to kick me around on the floor and knock the wind out of me. She would come out and take up for me, and he would hit her. I can't imagine why they left that in the trial transcript, because I think that explains everything. That explains everything. So here this woman who's like an angel, one of the few friends this kid has on campus, who's trying to keep him from being, brutally assaulted by her husband. She's about the last person on earth he would want to murder, especially so heinously. That makes no sense whatsoever. Well, why didn't he just try to attack her husband? And the other thing that strikes me is, if he allegedly breaks into her bedroom in the middle of the day, how do you know the husband wasn't behind that door? I mean, he may have been learning disabled. He was not stupid. And this is something that I think, this myth of the, hypersexualized young black person, it doesn't work. It doesn't fit. So this is a copy of the Robert's marriage certificate. As you can see, they were married in 1916. So as an old social worker, I did some digging. I worked for a couple of different agencies. I was with Children and Youth Services, the county's Child Protective Services, for a little over 13 years. So, I'm naturally curious about stuff. And so I'm digging into this family's background. None of this ever came up in court or in the newspapers whatsoever. So they had a child who died. And the child died of severe malnutrition. So, like the day she died, this kid died of malnutrition. So what condition was the mother in? She must have been incredibly malnourished as well. So this tells me this family had some serious problems. And then there's a second infant death in this family within just maybe 2 years or a little more. And this child dies from gastric enteritis, inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract. So, why is kind of up to debate, but 2 infant deaths within 3 years? Like, this is a family that has some issues. This is a family that has some problems. But none of this ever came out. This is where my friend Teresa Smithers earned her place in heaven, as far as I'm concerned. Teresa told me that they had actually been divorced, this couple. Now, they were presenting themselves as married, which, thinking, they probably kind of had to do that. Because a young, beautiful divorcee in 1930, working at an all-boys school, she probably wouldn't have gotten that job. My thinking is that because she had worked at 2 other boys' schools, New Jersey State School for Boys and also Belle Raven School in Maryland, she had a sterling work record. So my guess is probably that, and I found through my research that they had been separated both before and after their divorce in Michigan. So she probably came here first, and he probably told a great sob story, and maybe, the boy needs me, and I'll be good, et cetera, et cetera. There's kind of this circling, this vicious circle of violence and promises and being contrite and promising not to do it again, and then it happens again. So Vida actually sued for divorce in Michigan on the grounds of extreme cruelty. So this never came up. Never came up in the papers. It never came up at trial. I think this is extremely important evidence. Between this and the man's bloody handprint that didn't belong to Alexander, didn't belong to the victim, didn't belong to the victim's 10-year-old son, Whose bloody handprint was that? So this is I watch a lot of detective shows and forensic shows and stuff, and I thought, I'm doing this little mock-up picture. So you can see, and these are the reported heights and weights of these individuals, with Vida in the middle. Who's the more likely? Who's the more capable? And her ex-husband had a great deal of difficulty holding on to a job. He had worked for the railroad at one point. He had worked at the fire department. Now, this was 170 pounds, 5'7" doesn't sound big by today's standards. Certainly not by NFL football players. In those days, he was a pretty strong guy. Alexander didn't have the means or the ability to do this. As I said before, students had to be under supervision at all times. This was a prison. They couldn't just be going roaming around and hanging out at the water cooler. Only staff had keys, and the buildings had latched doors. So, Alexander didn't have the ability to do this. And in terms of that no one was seen coming or entering the building is no mystery to me, because tunnels connected all the buildings on campus, and that's what staff members used. So this is the third linchpin in the case for Alexander's innocence. So Mr. Schneider, his work supervisor, testified about his behavior the day of the crime. The school quickly came up with sort of a list of likely suspects out of the 600 boys who were there. And so there were only about a dozen or so who were out of supervision for any length of time during that day, and Alexander was one of them. And because he had a long record of misdemeanors and misbehavior and things like that, no violence, no incorrigibility, anything like that. But they assume that it's got to be him. So the work supervisor said, yeah, he was in my charge, and one of 10 boys. I sent him and Earl Troutcher, who was a white kid, to go get these shovels, 10 shovels, about a block and a half I should judge, he said. They returned in 20 minutes. Schneider testified when he returned, Alexander gave him a piece of paper and asked me to deliver that piece of paper to the man that had charge of the tool room, this guy named Mr. Hughes, and which should indicate that Schneider had received the shovels. All through the trial testimony, nobody would call this a receipt. They just kept he had a piece of paper folded in his hand. They wouldn't call it a receipt. There's a piece of paper. Okay. More about that in a minute. So he gives the slip of paper back to Alexander and tells him to return it. Schneider in his testimony said when Alexander returned, he didn't appear nervous or excitable, and that he did not observe any blood on Alexander, and there was nothing unusual or unnatural about his behavior. So if you stab somebody 47 times with a knife pick, you're going to have some blood on you. And in fact, the husband testified when he found her body, it looked like 10 buckets of blood on the bed. But this kid goes back to work wearing the exact same clothes. He's not out of breath. He doesn't have a drop of blood on him, but he committed this really heinous murder. Wearing the exact same clothes. So this documents Alexander's whereabouts at the time of the murder, and also his physical appearance and condition and his mental appearance and condition. Like I say, he wasn't out of breath. He wasn't excited. He wasn't, he just walked back to his assignment like he was supposed to. So this is Vida's death certificate. And when I saw this, it was a Sunday night, and I was having a salad while I'm, cruising the internet. And when I saw this, I jumped out of my chair because I thought I was going to be violently sick. So you can see, this is by the coroner. It was done on October 4th, this death certificate, the day after Vida died, after he examined her. Somebody in a different handwriting and a different ink wrote the cause of death, ice pick in the hands of Alexander Williams. Okay. I don't know who wrote that. Because you can see the black writing, and you can see the signature, of George Rigby. That's not his writing. That's not his handwriting. And the thing that baffles me even more than that is Alexander did not confess to the murder until 3 days after this form was filed. So how do they know 3 days from now he's going to confess to this heinous murder? Do they have ESP? You know? So much was made about this bloody handprint. You know, when the investigators, you know, we're going to find out who did this. It was never mentioned again. It was not mentioned at trial. It was not mentioned in the newspapers. It wasn't mentioned because it wasn't his handprint, and it didn't fit the theory. So whose bloody handprint was that on the wall in this room when this kid goes back to work wearing the same clothes without a drop of blood on him? How is that possible? So, you know, why was he forced to make 3 separate confessions? One was not enough. Apparently he wasn't a good enough confessor the first time around. Like I said, each one is written in a more sophisticated way, and the third, you know, is more lurid than the other 2. So, you know, there's some constitutional issues here. Fifth Amendment, you know, against self-incrimination. The Sixth Amendment Confrontation Clause, which means in a court you're supposed to get to be able to confront the people who are alleging, you know, what your crimes are. So the school superintendent, when he was interviewing Alexander, he was saying, well, you were seen at the scene of the crime. You were seen there. Nobody saw him at the scene of the crime. First of all, because he wasn't at the scene of the crime, and this witness was never produced. And he said, well, where's the receipt that you said you had? Where's the piece of slip of paper? So Alexander's reaching in his pockets and says, I don't know. I don't know. It must be in my other clothes. He said, well, you never had that slip of paper, did you? You were lying the whole time, weren't you? And Alexander says, yes. But at court, the school superintendent, Major Hickman, said, I knew he didn't have that slip of paper because I had it. So you're saying this kid didn't have a receipt, but you've got it in your possession? Fred's account of finding Vida Rivera's body differs from the Chester Times and in a letter he wrote to a Michigan newspaper. This is Alexander's death certificate. I also have a copy of his autopsy, and after the prison doctor did his autopsy. So you can see judicial electrocution. There was nothing judicial about it. But I'll show you a close-up in a second. But look at the age, block number 7. Okay, you see that 6 turned into an 8? I mean, that's how a 7th grader would forge a note from his parents. Okay, that's the close-up. And even worse, they didn't change the year, so the math doesn't work. And so I was curious about this distance. So how long would it take? How far could you go in 20 minutes? So I did a couple of little time trials around media. I walked some short blocks, I walked some long blocks, that type of thing. Walking speed is roughly about 3 miles an hour, 3.1, you know, some sort of, you know, all of this. So, you know, basically, it takes you about 10 minutes to walk half a mile. So if Alexander was going for 20 minutes, 20 of those minutes was spent walking. He was only going for 20 minutes. But the prosecution said he did all these 15 separate actions, including a brutal, bloody murder and a cover-up and going back to his, you know, to wash his hat and coming in and going back to work. It's impossible. I mean, just by going what they said. So my argument is not that, oh, well, you know, he was just a poor black kid and you got to understand. No. This is systemic racism. Like, the math doesn't work, you know? Like, the only way he could have committed this crime is if he had the ability to stop time. And that should not be a requirement for a murder conviction. So one of the things I did was, again, trying to piece together an argument for a case that, you know, was almost 90 years old. I had a couple of contacts, and I met with two school psychologists who do the evaluations for the juvenile detention center. Because it's likely, you know, had they been around on that day, they probably would have been interviewing Alexander, and so they wrote up a report for me. And just, you know, not going to read the entire thing, but, you know, they see him as intellectually deficient. He has delayed academic achievement and limited language comprehension. Comprehension, they keep saying, is a primary issue. He had limited awareness of his severity. A few days, he was in another magistrate's hearing because his mother, I think, kind of got him to say there was another kid involved, and you know, they had a hearing, and then Alexander said no, he wasn't. But the other kid's attorney said, you know you're going to your death on Monday, right? And Alexander stuttered. He said, I didn't know that, not till you said that. So here, this kid's going to be electrocuted in 2 or 3 days, and he's not aware of that. He doesn't understand that. Doesn't appear to have higher level ability for abstract thinking. A crime like this, which would have to, you know, be planned out so well and executed so well, this kid didn't have it. He didn't have the wherewithal for detailed, thought-out planning and organization. Doesn't have a history of violence or aggression. He was accused of fire setting, which, you know, from my years with Children's Youth Services, particularly with younger children, that's often a manifestation of child sexual abuse. And he lived in this big ramshackle house with his 11 siblings and 2 parents and 3 boarders. And in talking with his sister, I brought this up, and his sister said, well, you know, one of my sisters accused one of the boarders of trying to molest her, and my mother didn't want to hear it, and she, you know, disciplined my sister. Social cognition limited. Likely had a history of substance abuse. If you're stealing 110 cans of shoe polish and it's not for shoes, the impulse to just confess to the crime, this is so typical, even today. Even today. You know, the 5 teenagers that Donald Trump had to, you know, was trying to get executed, Central Park 5, they confess because nobody can stand up to that kind of questioning and probably abuse, you know. And oftentimes, you know, teenagers will think, you know, well, this will get straightened out later. You know, if I just make this stop right now. So the conjectures here mitigate Alexander's culpability in light of his, you know, not having any violence tendencies. This was a crime of passion. If you stab somebody 47 times and you break their ribs and you fracture their skull, this is not like shoving somebody down on the bed. This is punishment. This is long-term pent-up punishment. So again, he lacked the intellectual, moral, emotional capacity to you know, commit this crime. And the speed at which his guilt was determined, most likely from a need to hold someone responsible for the terrible crime. He was a convenient scapegoat. Profile doesn't fit him being capable of homicide. Had this crime occurred today, Alexander would be afforded more substantial legal representation, as well as in-depth psychosocial evaluation. So just to wrap up, you know, the lack of fingerprints, the lack of direct evidence, you know, this was a crime of passion. And there were 2 different versions of his last moment. So the Chester Times, which I think was sort of downplayed for the local audience, Williams dies in chair. Williams passed his last hours on earth quietly. He conferred with Father McCreish and walked to the death chamber at Rockview State Prison at 7 o'clock in the morning without any visible signs of emotion. So this is very sanitized. So the Reading Eagle, the day later, their headline is, "Weeps on the way to the electric chair. Sobbing and barely able to walk, the youth was supported on the death march by guards. He was strapped in the electric chair at 7:01, and after 1 contact, was pronounced dead at 7:06. So this is a kid who had no idea why he was sitting in an electric chair, who did not commit this crime. Could not have. I mean, put aside the fact, like, whether he was capable or not, he had time to do this crime. And all the evidence points to his innocence. And I think much of the evidence points to the ex-husband. you know, who had the means, the motive, the opportunity, who was actually, you know, as I said, her ex-husband. So a couple of years ago, I finally I tried to speak to his oldest sister before she passed away. She did not want to talk to me. I called her on the phone. We had some mutual contacts. She just, I could hear in her voice, she said, I'm really upset about this. I really don't want to talk about it. And I didn't have the heart to keep her on the phone another second. A few years ago, as things were kind of getting heated up and I was really wanted to publish a book about this, I talked to the sole surviving sister actually, Susie. And that's her right in the middle. That's Robert Keller, attorney. He was, I was referred to him by the Delaware County Bar. The bar has been phenomenally supportive of me. When my great-grandfather passed away in 1945, the family was very poor. They were never able to purchase a headstone for him. So, several decades later, I got in touch with the bar. The bar contributed some money along with my family. We pulled our money and got a headstone for my great-grandfather. There's a really phenomenal minute and resolution upon the death of William H. Ridley. And it really talks about, it was a special session held in the courthouse in February 1945 when he died. It really spoke about him in just the highest glowing terms. Even though he was limited by the racial realities of his time, they spoke very highly of him. And it also begins with talking about his father, about how his parents came up out of slavery during the Civil War. And it says, no man stood higher in the estimation of the people than Cornelius Ridley. That's pretty amazing for a guy who was born a slave. So what Robert Keller suggested was that we go for an expungement of the conviction. Basically, it just means that on the county level, it's taken off the books. The conviction record is taken off the books. I said I do not want a full expungement. I want a partial expungement because I want those records preserved. I didn't tell the judge why, but the only way I can ever possibly get this back into court is if that original 1931 trial transcript was still in existence. So we had a hearing on this day. Actually, the day on the right, the photograph on the right, it was a Friday morning. It was a snowstorm. Susie, who is Miss Susie, who's she's 88 now. She would have been 87. That's one of her nieces. She braved a snowstorm, came up from Chester. She uses a walker and a cane, got to court 15 minutes early before the start of the trial. The judge came in and did not even acknowledge her presence. He was phenomenally rude. He was angry. He chewed out Keller. Said, you don't have standing to bring this case into court. I have had my people up all, till the wee hours last night trying to find if you had standing on this matter. So you had like 3 months notice, and the night before the exam, you're up cramming for it, So he said, I'm not going to let a show go on. So he wouldn't let us speak, because Keller wanted to put me on the stand and be the witness and kind of go through all this. So they scheduled another hearing, but in the meantime, the district attorney's office finally caved in, perhaps because the district attorney at that time was going to be running for judgeship and didn't want a messy, wrongful conviction to try and explain to the community. So they said, okay, we'll agree to this. But it was horrific to treat an 87-year-old woman this way, whose brother essentially had been murdered by the system. There's no show going on here, And maybe he was offended by some of the things I had said in the newspapers. So that's Miss Susie. That's her daughter on the right there. That's some of her nieces and nephews. Just a really wonderful person. So Alexander was buried without a headstone in Green Lawn Cemetery, which is an abandoned cemetery. It's been abandoned for decades. It was a family cemetery at one point for 3 generations. The newest generation didn't want to deal with it. They essentially walked away from it. They didn't tell families of people who were buried there. So when those people came to visit their loved ones, they found a weed-strewn, overgrown cemetery. And the former owners won't talk to anybody. They have nothing to do with it. I've talked to him twice. Mary Schaefer from the Inquirer called him. I think he doesn't want to talk to it because he probably had some shady business dealings regarding that cemetery. A number of us made 5 or 6 trips out there to try and find this grave. We finally kind of narrowed it down based on a number of things. To one particular area, there's an area where some other Williams family members are buried. My neighbor has a funeral home. He had the guy who digs graves for him come out, and they do this thing called sounding. So it's like a collapsible rod. So you can see if the earth has been disturbed or not. If it's been disturbed, then there's a good chance there's a grave down there. And if it hasn't, then it's safe to bury there. So he did that. He took measurements. He did this. He said, this is really odd. And he said, this is a small grave. This is the size of a child or a small adult. He said, I think there are actually 2 people buried here. So since Alexander's family didn't have money for a headstone, it was just a pauper's grave, and he was likely buried there. So one of the things that we did, and actually the family did this, and I facilitated getting it, but we designed this gravestone for him and had a ceremony out at the grave. There it is, in September. That's Miss Susie, and there's Keller and I and other family members. We got some great coverage, wonderful article in Delaware County Daily Times, which I just can't thank highly enough, because they consider Alexander one of their own, and they have spared no ink with giving us press coverage about this. Philadelphia Inquirer has been extremely generous as well. As you can see, they're setting the headstone in there. And this is a terrific article by Alfred Lubrano. It's still on the Philly.com website if you want to check it out. And the title is finally, a headstone for a restless soul executed for a murder no one believes he committed. And just talk about families and healing and intergenerational pain, like that picture of her looking down at a bright, beautiful headstone for her brother who was wrongfully executed nearly 9 decades ago, just says a lot. So, Teresa, I don't know if you're listening up there, but if you can hear me, we're looking at your picture. So Teresa was kind enough to send me this picture. Like I said, she was a godsend to me. I would not have known about this divorce. I would not have known, about the violence of the. Apparently, Fred Robert came from a very violent, hard-drinking French-Canadian family. He had a brother who spent about 38 years in the penitentiary in Michigan for a bludgeoning murder. It was a robbery murder. He had another brother who spent 5 years in another prison. I'm not sure why, but this is all stuff I found out from the census and other things. So she says, we were always told there was a curse on our family. So many men died young, including my own father. But what we thought was a curse may have just been inherited guilt passed down in our DNA. When I came across reports of Vida's murder in 1930 newspapers, I saw it as a clear case of domestic violence where the husband got away with murder. We are a lot more aware of domestic violence crime these days. Being able to say this publicly and to do what I could to stand up for the innocence of Alexander Maclay Williams not only helped me in a small part to atone for and help heal the inherited guilt in our family, but also allowed me to heal myself through her. So I told her it was quite touching. Again, the critical pieces of evidence I found are because of Teresa. So where did I get this part of my culture and interest in terms of people who have died and things? It comes from my family. This is a group of my cousins and I who there's only one still surviving, Connie. She's on the foreground in front there, out of Eden Cemetery. That's where most of my family is buried. And back in the old days, my grandmother would take us out to the cemetery, all the kids out there, and we'd go out there and have picnics and stuff. And I didn't think it was weird having a picnic in a cemetery. And also back in those days, a lot more people came to the cemeteries. And on 4th of July, Memorial Day, they'd have bands and things like that. But it was an important piece of our culture. And so we never felt weirded out about going to cemeteries. And I still hang out in cemeteries a lot today. But this is in part where it stems from. Obviously, that was me on your far left. It also comes from my great-grandmother, Josefa Constantia Phillips Ridley, who was born in the Danish Islands, Danish West Indies, which are now the U.S. Virgin Islands. She was a devout Lutheran, but also just as devout in the island religion, which is probably Obeah, which is in the English-speaking Caribbean countries, islands, it tended to be Obeah. There's also some of this, I think, in the Carolinas as well. In the French-speaking islands, it's Voodoo, and in the Spanish-speaking islands, it's Santeria. But they're all stemmed from West African folk religions. So she made an indelible impact on my family, and very much into spirituality. She had a favorite ghost, and she had his name was Charlie, and she had a chair in the living room for Charlie, and none of her grandkids were allowed to sit in Charlie's chair, and she would leave food out for him sometimes, and she would also sometimes take red brick dust and sprinkle it in front of the doors and windows to keep out the evil spirits. She made a big impact on our culture and on our beliefs. As long as we were talking about her, it was kind of a comfortable subject, but there are members of my family and I who had experiences all their lives. Back when I was doing my dissertation at Penn, I conducted a formal study of about 35 family members, and I would say about 75% of us had extrasensory experiences, very, very powerful. We never really, although we called it the gift, we didn't look at it that way at all. It was really kind of, we looked at it as like a burden, something that we were ashamed of. So we didn't really discuss it with people. You know, just some really powerful tactile, auditory, and visual experiences. So I kind of categorized these as part of my study. But it was also kind of liberating for us as well to finally talk about this. And I had aunts and uncles who were like in their 60s and 70s back in those days, had never told each other about what they encountered. So my family had these two houses. We had the oldest house from 1872 to about 1972. Cornelius and Martha Jane, my ancestors first bought that after they arrived in Media. And then we had our current house, which I live in today, which we bought in which my great-grandfather bought in 1920. And that's our only property still in the family. But their experiences in both houses. Not so much today, because you know I've told them, if you want to talk to me, like come see me in my dreams, because I got to get up and go to work tomorrow. So you know I got to get in a good night's sleep, or else none of us are going to be here. Okay, so but it's an important part of our family history. That's my great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather Cornelius. He was born a slave in Virginia. He was the son of his enslaver, his owner. You can see that he doesn't look like a typical slave. You can't tell from the photo, but he had red hair, green eyes, white skin. He looked so white that he walked 300 miles from Bonnie Doon Plantation to Media. And he said he was never stopped along the way because everyone he met always assumed he was a white man. He didn't say otherwise. He arrived first. My guess is probably prior to the start of the Civil War, because as even a single white man roaming around the roads during the Civil War, it's probably not a good idea. So there was a Blackwater meeting, Quaker meeting, very close to where he came from, and I suspect that there were Quakers from that meeting who kind of helped steer him, because why else would he come to Media? And then a couple of years later, she and her children escaped and were reunited with them here in Media. This is the Bonnie Doon Plantation. So my grandmother knew the names of the plantations they came from, her grandparents came from, but she didn't know where they were. So I connected with a distant relative, a distant cousin actually. His ancestor was a slave on a neighboring plantation owned by the Ridleys. So his ancestor was probably my ancestor's uncle, and kind of sort of narrowed all this down. And so 1999, I went down there, went driving around asking people where this place was until we finally found it. That's probably one of the last surviving pictures of Bonnie Doon. And I can't tell you what an incredibly powerful, moving experience that was. Not to compare it to concentration camps, but but the level of, I know it happened on these plantations. And he was actually quite lucky because being the son of his master, he was their carriage driver, which on the scale of slave jobs, that was the best possible job you could have because he was able to travel by himself. You know, go pick up people, go pick up things, delivering. The average slave never traveled more than 5 miles from home, and that was deliberate because they wanted to keep them geographically ignorant. So I'm sure it's his geographic knowledge that helped him escape and make his way all the way up here to media. But I had some very powerful feelings and some images come into my mind when I was there. So Cornelius had a beautiful sister who was sold, and he never saw or heard from her again. And this is part of the burden that I carry. So this intergenerational pain. He never knew what happened to her. He loved her very much. And one of my goals in life has always been to find out what happened to Rosa. And I don't know if Rosa that's what my grandmother called her, a nickname, if her name was really Mary or Mary Rose or whatever exactly. But I looked through the Port of New Orleans slave import records. They were kind of like the FedEx documents of their day. They have since now been digitized and put on Ancestry.com, but at the time they were not. So I went to New Orleans twice to review these slave import records. And they were heartbreaking because somewhere 100 enslaved people being shipped, out of Baltimore, sometimes starting in New York even, down the coast around Florida and to New Orleans. I saw one that there was a child at the age of 9 being shipped by himself or herself. It was very, very painful to read those. So I think there's a good chance this could be Cornelius' sister. I can't prove it positively, but Apperson was a slave trader who had his own little slave jail, and he specialized in mulattoes. So I think it's really possible this could have been her. I haven't been able to get really any further. I don't know if she changed her name after she got to New Orleans or if she married somebody and changed her name. That's another problem with genealogy of enslaved people. But I think there's a real good chance that that's her. So this is Cornelius' wife at a younger age. I have an older picture of her, but I wanted to show you this one because Nancy Webster, as many of you might know, a local Quaker historian, she saw this picture and she said, "Did you know that that's slave garb?" I said, "No." She said, "Yeah." She said, "Oftentimes slaves would be forced to wear particular patterns so you could tell who they belonged to. So if they were far afield, you could say, 'What are you doing here? You're supposed to be, she was forced to be a breeding woman on her plantation. And she was so traumatized, she's starting at 14 years of age, so traumatized that she would not discuss the South after she came up here. We don't know how many children she had. My guess is she didn't escape from slavery until 1864, because she said she was at the Siege of Petersburg. That's when the Siege of Petersburg was, so I can I know she was still in Virginia at that time. Unlike Cornelius, she could not just walk away. So she and her brother, who had a 2-year-old, and she and her 2-year-old and 9-year-old waited until the Union Army was marching by on the way to the Siege of Petersburg. If you could make it to the Union Army lines, they would not send you back. Early in the war, they did. But General Benjamin Butler said, why are we doing this? This is valuable property to the Southerners. So a healthy male slave, particularly if he had a technical skill like a wheelwright, would be worth about $1,500 in 1860 dollars. So you can multiply that by at least 20 times. So it would probably be more like 40,000 today. A healthy woman like her, about $1,000. Again, multiply that by 20 or 30 times. Children were a good investment for slavers, plantation owners, because you could buy them more cheaply and they would last a long time. Whereas, so the Civil War definitely was about slavery. It was definitely about slaves creating and supporting the economic foundation of not just the South, but many other places as well. But very few average people owned slaves. The average slave owner owned 5 or fewer, and oftentimes was out there working in the field along with them. So, because if you figure, you have a man worth 40,000 and a woman worth 30,000. Few people had that kind of money. But Cornelius's father owned 300 slaves. There were few people in the South who owned that many. There were a few, like Washington, I think Jefferson, but there weren't many. So this is where she came from, and I have a picture of me and my distant cousin, and we're in a color picture taken about 6 years ago at this Fortsville plantation. But for much of my childhood, I had really disturbing nightmares. And I'm going to show you an article in a minute that talks about the nightmares being inherited. And in my nightmares, I would dream of a place that looked like this. And it would be at night, and I could hear the sound of shackles and people walking around, and their eyes looked like they were dead. They were black people. And it just terrified me. And then about 10 years later, I'm doing some research, and I come across this picture, and it was stunning to me, because this looked like the building, the buildings in my dream. And I had other nightmares and disturbing dreams too that I think now, since think were related to this history. There we go. Okay, so can trauma be passed down over the generations? This is kind of a touchy subject. There's good research that shows there's something to this. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that it's proven 100%. There are other people who say, no, that's not possible. Is it nature or is it nurture? But there do seem to be some biological issues in terms of chromosomes and things like that. So some people say the mark doesn't damage the gene. There's no mutation. It alters the mechanism by which the gene is converted and functioning. It isn't genetic, it's epigenetic. And so this is a field of research that's been getting more interest these days. And that there are differences in children's health later in life, descendants of these folks. And also, I mean, certainly biologically, health issues have been passed down over the generations among people of color who had slave ancestors. The slave diet was highly salted, high fat, very, not nutritious, or no vegetables, or sometimes they were able to grow some things on their own, but it was a diet that couldn't sustain that level of work that people had to do. So they were often sick. People died young. They were worn out. You take a bad beating, sometimes people just died from that. So it's remarkable that some slaves were able to escape at all. John Hope Franklin, the noted African-American scholar, said at the time of the Civil War, there were 4 million people held in bondage. Only 2% successfully escaped. Now, that's about 50,000 people, but that's 2%. So 98% of the people who tried to escape never made it. Never made it. Here's another article. This is from the National Institutes of Health. So this is from a researcher in Israel, looking at children and Holocaust survivors, and have terrible nightmares in which they are chased, persecuted, tortured, or annihilated, as if they were reliving the Second World War over and over again. Anxiety, depression. It seems that these individuals who are now adults somehow have absorbed the repressed and insufficiently worked through Holocaust trauma of their parents, as if they actually inherited the unconscious minds of their parents. Okay. Now again, there are more than 500 studies published. They still are unable to sufficiently explain how the unconscious trauma of a PTSD parent can be genetically transmitted to a child, and to verify this idea with sufficient empirical evidence. So there's something here. The jury's still out. but it's not all in people's minds. You know, obviously there's clearly biological things that are inherited, but I've always thought, you know, you start out from a single zygote. If it's possible to have the genetic information for hair color, eye color, height, you know, how tall we are, to have fingers, to have limbs, you're telling me that only the hardware gets passed along genetically? There's no software to go along with that? I don't believe that. I don't think that's possible. How do we know how hands are supposed to work? You know, so I think it's a more complicated issue. And as you can see, the issues are still out. There's another article. In fact, I meant to get these to. I meant to bring him here tonight for John, but I did not. But I can get them to him. Again, this idea of epigenetics has been around a while. This is another article, and you can certainly jot down the names of these articles, look them up on the internet. This is from October 2018. A new study of Civil War prisoners adds to the evidence suggesting that our parents, even grandparents' experiences may affect our DNA. Again, you know, there's a lot of debate. You can get just like two lawyers, you can get two scientists to argue about anything, but apparently there is something to this. So I'm just about done here, but I wanted to share this with you. This is a little bit about this in my book. This is George Stinney Jr. George Stinney Jr. is the youngest person executed in the 20th century. His case is it's eerily similar to Alexander's. So George Stinney and his sister were seen talking to two white girls, and lived on the other side of the tracks, I guess. The following week, the white girls were found dead because George Stinney had been seen talking to them. He was arrested. He was interrogated by 3 police officers, and he confessed to the crime. Again, there was almost no evidence. He was so little that he had to use a large Bible as a booster seat to sit in the electric chair. I think his trial lasted about 10 minutes. So his case was brought back into court by a local college professor who got in touch with a couple of lawyers, and they took it into federal court, and in December 2014, his conviction was vacated. So it doesn't mean that he was declared innocent. It means that he was not given a fair trial. So his conviction does not exist. So there's few. The problem with litigating rights of dead people is that it's extremely difficult, even if they totally got screwed over, even if they were wrongfully executed by the system. So this is what I want to do for Alexander. Originally, I was thinking of trying to get into the Pennsylvania Supreme Court because they have this provision called the King's Bench, which goes back to kind of medieval times, English common law, and basically, the courts can kind of decide whatever they want to decide. Particularly in cases like this, that there is no existing evidence anymore other than the trial transcript, which is invaluable. But my thinking is that since Alexander's case involves the same constitutional problems, violations, that my chances might be better in federal court. So that's what I'm angling to do right now. I know some people who know some people who were forwarded them a lot of information about the case for me. One of the groups is the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Sherlyn Eiffel is the director of that. And that was founded by Thurgood Marshall after he lost his first case before the U.S. Supreme Court. It was a case called Chambers v. Florida. Very, very similar to these cases. So that's one. And I'm also trying to see if I can get in touch with our new congressional representative to see if she might be able to get me in touch with some federal attorneys. The Justice Department does have a civil rights division, which Obama charged them with investigating cases like these old civil rights cases. Emmett Till case, is something that got back in touch. But this is a body of bad laws. It's not so much that the law is bad; it's how the law is administered. And if you look at the Death Row Stories, which is airing on the CNN, I think it's called HLN Network, Channel 101 on FiOS. There's a case by this guy, Walter Ogrod, O-G-R-O-D, lived up in Northeast Philadelphia. Learning disabled guy, He was convinced that he had murdered a young 4-year-old girl, sent to death row. They had paid snitches who were sharing information gleaned from the newspapers, who then invented stories. Oh yeah, he told me this, he told me that, and the district attorney at the time was using these snitches to prosecute the case. She would not allow DNA evidence to be tested, and so finally, I think just as of December, that case is going to be moving forward. I think that's the last. Let me see here. Okay, so yeah, I mentioned those things. This is the last slide. 3 families involved in this discussion, dealing with intergenerational pain, but by telling the truth, by setting that historical record straight, we're trying to engage in healing. And for Alexander and his family, and certainly Vida Robert and her family as well. And as I said, there's a spiritual underpinning to all this. It's not just names and dates and things like that. Genealogy is about revealing the past and about your ancestors. And what any genealogist will tell you is, when they're ready for you to know them, they will step forward. And I've often found that. There's a connection that I think goes beyond just biology, that there's another connection there. And as spiritual people, that should not be any surprise to any of us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks. I'll be here all week. Please be sure to tip your waitresses.
Wow, there's
Questions?
so much that you've shared with us. I like to honor our time, which is 7:30 to 9, and so if anybody needs to leave before we do some question and answer, this is your opportunity to do that. And I'm willing to stick around and take questions, and I assume you are as well. You're not that eager to just sell the book than to respond to questions. I saw Maurice here first.
Thank you. This has been fascinating and painful and enlightening, and so many things that one could say.
Thank you.
It brings to mind, to me, very strongly the work of Brian Stevenson. Just Mercy.
Absolutely.
Making this not happen.
Yes.
Anymore. People on death row where they don't belong.
Absolutely.
And I really like that connection. And his beautiful book, Just Mercy, deals with these kinds of things in the law, but with a deep spiritual sense. It's
Absolutely.
So I recognize you as Ken here too.
Oh, thank you, thank you. He's from Delaware, Yeah, I actually met Anthony Ray Hinton, who was one of the people that he was able to help, who spent 30 years on death row on trumped-up charges. I actually tried to get in touch with him. He's kind of busy, but I'm hoping one of these other avenues will work out. But that's a tough read to get through. I wept when I read that book.
You can't help it.
No.
So if you didn't hear that, folks at home, Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. Very powerful, just as tonight's was. Hands over here before we go to Patricia. Joan?
2 local sort of questions. Green Lawn Cemetery, is that the one on Conchester, near Chester, or is that
It's on Concord Road.
Concord Road near Chester?
Yes, it's very close to the Sun Studios Center.
Yeah, and around the corner from Judge Wright's old house, too. The other question I had was Ridley. How did that end up in Virginia and in Pennsylvania?
It didn't.
Okay.
Ridley in Pennsylvania is named for a different branch
That
of.
is so-
I think it's actually named for a town in England, whereas the Ridley family came here during the late 1600s. They go back to the time of the Norman Conquest.
Um,
It just
seems so odd.
Yeah, just an old English name. Not my Ridleys.
One thing, if I could just take the mic since I have it. That your great-grandmother was used as a breeding person
Yeah.
at 14 years it just, and that was in Virginia probably primarily for the purpose of sending her children south
Yes, you're absolutely right.
for profit.
Yes.
Not to be used, even to be sold.
Yes,
That is just,
You're absolutely right. It was a cottage industry in the upper South, because the plantations in the lower South were always in desperate need of slaves. The 12 years a slave, story, that's phenomenal. The average northern slave who was shipped to a plantation in Mississippi or Louisiana usually died in about 4 years. So the intense heat, the snakes, the insects, the brutal. So there's this little cottage industry grew up in Virginia and in the upper South, particularly as cotton and tobacco began leaching the land after a couple of hundred years. But that's an area of slavery that few people know anything about. Extremely repugnant.
I just wanted to know whatever happened with that handprint. How could they get around the handprint? Did they wipe it off? Did they wash it away?
They just totally ignored it. It was never mentioned again. It was, as you can see from the newspaper articles, oh yeah, we're going to find out who did this. And it was never mentioned again. I did contact the Pennsylvania State Police. They told me that after 75 years, their evidence is destroyed. So that would have been a few years, before I contacted them. But I just find it hard to believe that neither the Pennsylvania State Police nor the Delaware County District Attorney's Office have any evidence at all. I mean, you saw the district attorney in a couple of those pictures. I find it hard to believe that there's no archival information there, but so I have been told.
First of all, I just have to thank you, and I'm sure my thank you is very tiny compared to the thank you of your own ancestors. I'm enamored with the idea of finding such thorough information about the stories of your own ancestry, and I'm inspired.
Thank you.
So I thank you. I really don't know how to thank you.
Oh, you already have. Just by being here, you thank me.
I'm also curious for another reason, which I don't need to go into, but how did you find, or how are you connected to Morgan Munsey?
You know Morgan Munsey?
I know Morgans and I know Munseys, and I've never heard someone named Morgan Munsey, but it seems like a very popular name in the area where I'm living, and I was just curious, how are you connected?
Well, let's say his father played in the NFL, I think for Baltimore. He had an uncle who also played in the NFL back in the 60s. But I connected with him via Ancestry.com, or actually the precursor of Ancestry. We started writing, and he, although he grew up in Virginia Beach area, his grandparents were from Southampton County, so he spent all his summers there growing up. So he knew a lot about the history, he knew a lot about the ghost stories, he knew a lot about the culture of that area. So we were able to connect, and I went down there, we hopped in a car, we drove all around, and I wouldn't have found those places without him. I also, right about the same time, connected, I think it used to be called Roots.com or something like that before Ancestry came about. Ancestry, as you know, is a resource of the Mormon Church, Church of Latter-day Saints. They collect documentary records on everybody on the planet. They have the best records in the world, probably. Their original documents are kept in a vault underground somewhere in Salt Lake. But I also connected with a gentleman who was his family's historian, who was a direct descendant of Cornelius's father. So Colonel, Ridley III, Thomas Ridley III, and Brom McNichol. Brom Nickel was his name, And he and another one of his cousins wrote a voluminous history of the Ridley family. Just remarkably detailed, just absolutely phenomenal. The other guy I chatted with once or twice, but he didn't seem that interested in trying to help me. But Bram, was just absolutely wonderful. And when I graduated from got my doctorate at Penn, I sent him one of those little cards, announcement cards, and he wrote back to me and he said how proud he was, and he said that you are family, that you were that you're kin, and he signed it Cousin Bram. And so here you have the descendant of the slave owner and a descendant of the slave that they own calling each other cousin. And that's what makes America great. If we can we can't forget the past, ever. But if we can bridge that and recognize that we're all members of one human family, it's a wonderful thing. So that's how I got in touch.
That seems like a good place.
Yeah, one, two more quick ones?
I thought that was just a good coda there.
Sorry. My bad.
Can you tell more about the Yarnell family that,
The Yarnells?
yeah, the Yarnells?
I can only tell you it's a huge family. It's a huge Quaker family. Isaac and Elizabeth Smedley Yarnell are buried in, I believe, the Middletown Meeting graveyard there, but it's a very, they kind of have their own whole genealogy, but I did track down a descendant of those. I mentioned getting a headstone from my great-grandfather and his father, and so Chris Yarnell Sabinga came to that event, and I composed a letter of thanks from my family to her family. So, but they're, you can definitely look more of them, look up more about them. And one last question? Big family. I thought I had a big family, but the Yarnells.
First, just thank you so much. I'm really moved about how you lifted up the three families that are going through healing from this story. And I think it's the responsibility of all of us, and certainly I think a lot for myself as a white American to research my own family and know all of my complicated stories, and to tell truth, to get to healing. And I'm curious if you could say a little bit more, and I feel like you've alluded to it throughout, about there's that individual healing for families and for individuals, and I think there's also a level of truth-telling and healing, both at our intergroup level, our group levels, and our societal levels. And if you felt you could, speak to what truth-telling at those different levels might also look like.
Well, I think oftentimes, and this is one of the problems with genealogy research, it's always best to talk to your eldest relatives. But sometimes they don't want to talk about things because they find, being a breeding woman embarrassing, or things like that, or things that happened to people in the past as embarrassing. So, if you can bring that up, that's certainly healthy. One remarkable thing about telling family stories around the Sunday dinner table or Thanksgiving is everybody knows the stories. So if the storyteller veers from the official version, everybody's going to jump on that person. No, that's not how it happened. But it's a way of preserving our identity and our culture and our beliefs. It also, I think, benefits a larger society, because there's a lot of people in this country who feel like only white people invented important things or did important things in this country, and that couldn't be further from the truth. There are institutions, banks and insurance companies and universities today that are still incredibly wealthy off the labor of slaves. Slaves helped build the White House. Slaves helped build the Capitol building. The golden Statue of Liberty on top of the Capitol was in a foundry run by, or at least in which slaves worked. So it's important to heal the entire country. This idea of that only white people did things. The Chinese Americans built the Western railroads. They were horribly exploited. When the Irish first came here, they were treated like black people in many ways. Irish were disproportionately drafted into the Civil War, which caused a riot up there because the rich WASPs could pay their way out of that. And the Japanese Americans, they were interned, over 100,000 people. It can't be an accident that they had some of the best farmland in California either. So I think that, it starts on an individual level in terms of, wow, I really am descended from some amazing people. If we can see further today, it's because we stand on the giants of shoulders who came on the shoulders of giants who came before us. And then as a family, it gives us, a family identity and a family sense of healing. A lot of the Williams family will tell you, we never knew this stuff about Alexander because his parents never talked about it. They never mentioned his name. So it's incredibly healing for them as well. And then, you read what, my friend Teresa said as well. So I think the more that we, Faulkner said the past isn't dead, it's not even past. And I think we have to get away from this idea of thinking that the past is important, because everything today is built on the foundation of the past. And if we can tell the proper story of, the ways that America was discovered, Columbus wasn't the first, he was one of the last who got here, all the different ethnic groups who built America, and, that everybody should have a seat at the table, that we're all members of one human family. And the only thing needed for evil to triumph in the world is for good people to do nothing. So it's not enough that we're just good people. We've got to be soldiers for social justice. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to everybody who tuned in.